Hello, good evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Clement's Yule, and this is the A to Z of Catholicism. And tonight it's N is for nullity of marriage. Now, why did I choose this one? Well, I mean, this is sort of a slightly strange course, isn't it? It's just topics of interest. It's a bit of a difficult subject, the nullity of marriage. Not very many people understand it particularly well, and it does need to be explained, and it does require some clear thinking, and it also requires sometimes for people to sort of be very sort of restrained, neutral, and legalistic in their thinking. Now, people often accuse the Catholic Church of legalism. This was done by both the Lutherans, accused us of legalism. What really marks the beginning of the Reformation is the burning of the collections and compendiums of canon law. And of course, the Orthodox accuse us of legalism as well. But legalism ain't all bad, I have to tell you. You've all got houses, and if somebody just squatted in your house, moved into your house, and you said to them, "You have no right to be here, please go away," they would accuse you of legalism. And you'd realize at that point that legalism was quite a good thing. It protects the rights of the individual. Legalism, legality. And of course, anybody who enters into marriage enters into a covenant, but also enters into a contract. And so one has to approach marriage from that aspect as well. Now, I mentioned when I was publicising this the cases of Henry VIII and the case of Boris Johnson, both of which are in the public domain. Okay, so I'm not breaking any confidences. Now, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, and he then became rather disappointed because she didn't produce a living son, and also she was 6 years older than him. And the other thing was, of course, he'd spotted Anne Boleyn, and at that time he thought she was really nice and wanted to marry her. And he was also convinced that she would be able to give him sons. But marriage, according to the teaching of the Church, is indissoluble. It cannot be dissolved. If you get married, that's it, life. And this is very clear in St. Mark's Gospel, chapter 10. If a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery. And it was because you were so unteachable that Moses allowed you to divorce, but this was not the same. This was not from the beginning. In the beginning, God made them male and female, and whatever becomes one flesh is joined forever and cannot be unjoined. It's a bit like scrambled eggs. Once scrambled eggs are scrambled, they cannot be unscrambled. They are joined forever. One of the things is, and that's true existentially, if you remember when Princess Diana divorced her husband, or her husband divorced her, they were still joined at the hip. They weren't joined by love, they were joined by hatred, and hatred is a love gone wrong, but it's a form of love, isn't it? You can't divorce is actually an impossibility in the teaching of the Church and in the teaching of Jesus Christ. So the only way that Henry VIII could get himself free of his tie to Catherine of Aragon was to have the marriage annulled. It's often called the divorce, but it wasn't the divorce, it was an annulment. Now, the terrible thing was, the way he tried to go about this was Catherine had been married before to his elder brother, Prince Arthur, and then Prince Arthur had died. She'd been married to Prince Arthur for about 6 months when Arthur had died. And Henry's grounds for annulment was that Catherine was his sister-in-law, and to marry his sister-in-law, he had to get a dispensation from the Pope. And because it says in Leviticus 20:21, wait for it, here it is, if a man takes his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. And of course, he did have a child with Catherine of Aragon, but no son. So he thought he'd been cursed by God for marrying against the law of God. But the Pope had given him a dispensation. So what he had to argue, what his lawyers had to argue, is that the Pope should never have given the dispensation in the first place, and that the marriage was null and void from the start, because the dispensation was incorrect. So that was what everything turned on. And in the end, of course, the Pope ruled that the original dispensation had been perfectly correct and the marriage had been a perfectly valid marriage and therefore could not be set aside. Whereupon, of course, Henry VIII sacked the Pope as head of the church. It put in a much better person as head of the church, namely himself, and then got his Archbishop Cranmer to do his own bidding and announce and annul the marriage. Anyway, so it all turns on this thing from Leviticus 20:21. At the same time, Deuteronomy 25:5 says, if your brother dies, you must marry his widow to produce children for your late brother. So the scriptures contradict each other on that. And many people throughout the ages have married their sisters-in-law or their brothers-in-law when I know somebody actually whose parents, the father married the girl, she died. She died, and then he married the girl's sister, who'd been a bridesmaid at the wedding. It was really quite common. And so it's nothing wrong with that at all. But of course, the Pope had dispensed from it. So that annulment did not go down very well at all. In fact, that annulment failed. And anyway, there it is. That was. Now, what about the case of Boris Johnson? Boris Johnson was baptized as a Catholic. Boris Johnson is a Catholic. Boris Johnson's mother was a very devout Catholic and had him baptized and so on. However, Boris, funny, never showed much interest in religion and never went to a Catholic church or anything like that. When he got married, first of all, to the beautiful Allegra Mostynowin, he did not marry her in the Catholic church. Secondly, he married Marina Wheeler, and he did not get married in the Catholic church. Then, after he divorced both of these wives, he met up with, what's she called? Carrie. Carrie what? Carrie Fisher. No, Carrie Fisher, somebody else. Carrie. Anyway, he met Carrie, who was a Catholic and quite a good Catholic, it seems, according to what.
The man who's married, but yeah.
Yeah. She's a Catholic, and she went round to Westminster Cathedral and said, I want to marry this man who's never been married in church. He is a Catholic, and he is free to marry. And as a result, they were married in Westminster Cathedral. Now, Boris's first two marriages would have been investigated by the church and set aside, declared null, on grounds of lack of canonical form. What does canonical form mean? It means everybody who is a Catholic has to get married in front of their parish priest, in their parish church, in the parish of their residence. This is a very old law of the church, and this affects the validity of the wedding. It's a very old law of the church. It was because in the Middle Ages, beautiful young girls would be sitting by the roadside and knights on chargers would come by, snatch them off, and they would find some dodgy priest who would immediately marry them. And this was to stop clandestine marriages, illegal marriages, and marriages, things like that. So you had to get married in your parish church with the parish priest doing it. Now, this sometimes happens that you are not resident in the parish, in which case you have to prove, let's say somebody from Epsom wants to get married here, they have to get the written permission of the parish priest of Epsom to marry here, and the parish priest of Epsom will delegate me to do the wedding. If they come from Worcester Park and they want to get married here, the parish priest of Worcester Park would have to delegate me to do the wedding, but they would have to ask permission of the Archdiocese of Suffolk, who would pass it on to the Diocese of Arundel and Brighton, who'd pass it down to me. Everybody's got to get married in their own diocese. That is one of the reasons why when people come to their parish priest and say, we want to get married abroad, the parish priest says, congratulations, and inside his heart sinks, because he knows he will have to do a whole load of paperwork to facilitate the marriage abroad, so that it is canonical form. If a Catholic boy goes off and marries an Anglican girl in an Anglican church, he does not marry her. The marriage is invalid. the marriage is null and void. The wedding, it just doesn't work at all. However, if two unbaptized people get married somewhere, either in an Anglican church or in a registry office, that is a valid marriage. So it's Catholics are bound to get married in the Catholic Church, but non-Catholics can get married wherever they like. But what the marriage they contract is completely valid. But a Catholic, to contract a valid marriage, has to get married in his or her parish church with the requisite paperwork done. Okay? Now, because Boris hadn't got married in a Catholic church before, he was free to marry. If he wants to get divorced and annulled from carry, he's going to have a bit of a problem because he's now properly married for the first time in his life. So that is rather important. Now, the status of the children from the previous marriage is what it's always been. The Catholic Church does not declare anybody illegitimate or legitimate anymore. And indeed, the question of legitimacy and illegitimacy, if you have a lady friend and you have a child, and then later you get married in a Catholic church, the church deems your children to be legitimate, retroactively legitimate. But this idea of legitimate and illegitimate is now virtually meaningless because there's only one legal disability that comes from illegitimacy. Do you know what that is? Inheriting titles of nobility. So, for example, there was a guy at Oxford who was a Viscount X, and he had an illegitimate child with his lovely girlfriend. And then I think later on, he might have married her and he had other children, and they would not have the first child would not have inherited the title unless he had petitioned the Committee of Privileges of the House of Lords to have the child legitimised. You can have a child legitimised by law. That's the only thing that goes against it. I have a funny feeling as well that you might have difficulty with, if somebody dies intestate without a will, that illegitimate children might have a bit of difficulty making a claim on the will compared to legitimate children. Or do they just do DNA now? I've never heard of anybody being, what's the word I'm looking for, disadvantaged from being illegitimate. Have you?
No, I'm just wondering what the Catholic Church... No.
But what does it mean? I'm legitimate, you're legitimate, they're illegitimate. What's it mean? Their parents weren't married when they were born? That's what it means. What difference does it make? You know, you don't have to go and join a different queue, a bit like EU passports and non-EU passports. You don't, as far as I'm aware. So anyway, but of course it was terribly important at the time of Henry VIII, because the Catholics regarded Elizabeth as illegitimate, because Henry wasn't married to Anne Boleyn, and then Henry himself said he wasn't married to Anne Boleyn, but he left the throne in his will to Elizabeth, who was illegitimate, and an illegitimate child cannot inherit the throne. So it was quite awkward. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the legitimate child of James V of Scotland. She had an illegitimate half-brother, but he couldn't inherit the throne and so on. There were lots of Henry II or Henry I had loads of illegitimate children, but they couldn't inherit the throne. But I can't remember the last king. William IV had 10 illegitimate children by Mrs. Jordan, and they couldn't inherit the throne. There are lots of them around, the descendants, including David Cameron was a descendant of William IV, on the wrong side of the blanket, as they say. So David Cameron, if Mrs. Jordan had married William IV, David Cameron would be king or something. I don't know. There are quite a lot of them. Anyway, he had 10 children. Okay, now, so this is, so Boris was saved from the consequences of his first two weddings by the fact that he'd been baptized a Catholic, even though he'd never lived as a Catholic. So he was very lucky in that regard. Okay, now, yeah, anyway, the next thing is this. Nullity is usually based on Canon 1095. And it says in Canon 1095, the following are incapable of contracting marriage: those who lack the sufficient use of reason. Mad people can't get married, or profoundly intellectually disabled people can't get married, lacking the use of reason, because they can't make matrimonial consent. They can't consent to the proposition of marriage. They can't say I do, because they can't understand what marriage is. 2, those who suffer from a grave defect of discretion of judgment concerning the essential matrimonial rights and duties mutually to be handed over and accepted. I'll get back to that. Those who are not able to assume the essential obligations of marriage for causes of a psychic nature. Now, and usually it's number 2, which is the fount of nullity. Those who lack, you say that the couple or one of the couple was not able to make consent, was not able to consent to marriage because of their immaturity of judgment. But this has to be proved. Now, what does it really mean? You were too immature. They have a grave defect of discretion of judgment. Now, they say they want to get married. They go through a marriage course saying, yes, I want to get married. I understand what marriage is all about. I know what it's all about. However, they are, because they're so immature, they are unable, when they say that, they don't really understand marriage. And as soon as they get married, they realise that they made maybe a terrible mistake because they're really not up to being married or making the lifetime commitment that marriage requires to another person. When they say I do, they are signing up to something that they don't really understand. And this, of course, can be interpreted in 2 ways. It can be interpreted very strictly, or it can be interpreted very liberally. Now, the other thing is you also need to get proof. So when he says, it's almost always he or she says she wants to get married again, and she says, my husband was too immature to marry me, and therefore I want the marriage set aside. I want the marriage annulled. Or he says, my wife was too immature to marry me. I want the thing set aside. Now, this can actually be true. So, for example, I'm trying to think of cases I have known. There was a woman I know who said to her mother a week before the wedding, I don't want to marry this man. And the mother said, but darling, I've already ordered the flowers. And she realized she could not go back. And there was another person who said, I don't want to go through this marriage. And her sister said to her, but darling, your face is on all the tea towels. And so she had to go through with the marriage. Yeah, and I knew somebody who was in the room when that happened. The other thing is, I did know somebody who married a man who was an alcoholic from the age of 13. And when he married her, he was an alcoholic, and he was married to the bottle, essentially. He couldn't really make a commitment to another person. So the actual commitment is, if you're not capable of making the commitment, you really ought not to get married, and you can get the marriage annulled on the grounds that you are not able to make that commitment. Now, for example, how do you prove that? Well, auditors, as they're called, go around and interview people about the state of mind of the couple before the wedding. What was he like? Oh, he was a really nice guy. However, I always thought he was a bit strange because, he was etc. He, for example, he was totally uninterested in getting married. When we were discussing the flowers, he wasn't interested. When we were discussing the wedding reception, he wasn't interested. When we said, where should we have the wedding, which church, he wasn't, and so on and so forth. That shows a lack of commitment to the marriage project. Now, it has to be said, as I say, it can be liberally interpreted or narrowly interpreted. In America, it's liberally interpreted. In Italy, it is narrowly interpreted. So very few people in Italy get annulments, but in America, thousands and thousands are given every year.
Doesn't seem very fair.
No, it doesn't. If you want to get an annulment in Nairobi, forget about it. You cannot get an annulment because there is no tribunal. Now, when you ask for an annulment, you go to the place where you live and you say, and you petition the tribunal, and the tribunal, you fill out a form, and then the tribunal sends people to interview all the witnesses. In Nairobi, at least when I lived there was no tribunal. So that meant that you had no possibility of getting an annulment. The other thing is, if you, let's say, live in Ascoli Piceno, you go to the local the tribunal and they say, and it takes them 20 years. Because, in Italy, they like to do things very properly and carefully and thoroughly. And, it takes 20 years. In England, it will take, sometimes it can take up to 2 years. But some of them are really very, very quick. My friend, I won't mention her name because it's going onto the internet. Her husband married a divorced lady in a registry office, and therefore he had to produce before the Tribunal of Westminster his marriage certificate, his divorce certificate, her first marriage certificate, and her divorce certificate. So they were able to see that she was already married. She couldn't marry him, and therefore he was free to marry. And sending in that paperwork, they looked at it, stamped the document, say, "Yep, fine, you're free to marry." And they gave him and therefore he was free to marry. And I think that took about 6 weeks, maybe less. Whereas, of course, in Ascoli Piceno, or even in Ferrara, that might take about 6 months or 6 years or something like that. It takes a long time in Italy, a long time. But here, and the other thing, of course, I remember in Westminster, it was pretty straightforward. But I do remember this guy, when I used to live in Cardiff, ringing me up and said, "Oh, could you go and talk to this person and about take the evidence for this annulment?" I said, "Oh, yeah. So I'll send you all the papers." I said, "Okay, fine." And he sent me all the papers. And it was quite extraordinary. It had sat on his desk for 5 years. And all the papers were constant letters saying, "Are you working on that annulment? Have you done this?" And it was just so that they could hear one person's evidence. 5 years it had sat on his desk. And a lot of inefficiency, as you know, is sitting on papers, sitting on people's desks. And maybe there are not enough people to shuffle the paper around. But don't forget, in England, all the work is done by volunteers. I mean, I used to go and be an auditor and hear all sorts of things and so on and so forth. And I'd write it up and you'd do a précis. Sometimes you'd talk to somebody for about 3 or 4 hours and you'd do a précis, which was about 5 or 6 sentences. Because most of the stuff they were telling you about how ghastly their ex-husband was actually irrelevant. Because what you really want to know is what was going on before the marriage. You see, was he capable of matrimony? No, lots of lay people are auditors. I'm amazed. Anybody can be an auditor. Would you like to be an auditor? Because we can easily arrange it. Who is that walking outside? I don't know, with a torch. Anyway, so now that is usually the fount of nullity. And this one, lacking due discretion, is, some people say, the most abused fount of nullity. Because, I was 18 years old. I didn't know what I was doing. My mother-in-law was holding a shotgun to my head, etc. That sort of thing. Also, this is an interesting one. Canon 1102, Part 1, a marriage subject to a condition about the future cannot be contracted validly. In other words, if you have a prenuptial agreement, it invalidates your marriage. With my body I thee worship, with all my worldly goods I thee endow. I think that's the Anglican service, but that is correct. Now, and so a prenup invalidates the marriage because you're not entering into consortium totius vitae, the sharing of the entire life. Also, a marriage is invalid if entered into because of force or grave fear from without, shotgun marriages. Even if unintentionally inflicted, so you think your future mother-in-law looks very fierce. She hasn't actually waved a shotgun at you, but you're frightened she might do. In fact, she's a really nice person. She wouldn't, it's her appearance is against her. But you're unintentionally inflicted by her the pain or by the fear. So you're compelled to choose marriage in order to get away from the thought that your mother-in-law is going to kill you. even though she's harmless. But it's subjective fear, not actual fear. So fear, force kidnapping people to force them into marriage. That is wrong. Kidnapping people to force them into marriage is pretty rare. It does happen, I think, in I Promessi Sposi by Alessandro Manzoni. And, of course, it does happen very commonly in India. Girls are kidnapped and forcibly converted to Islam and married. I mean, they're raped, actually. That is what happens to them. But again, how do you prove that? You have to enter into a canonical process, which means evidence gathering, paperwork, and things like that. It doesn't cost anything. Though sometimes I believe the tribunal solicits a contribution, because the tribunal, which is run by a layperson in the Philip Howard Centre, the tribunal does lots of photocopying, lots of postage and things like that. One of the things that's really awkward is when the co-respondent refuses to play ball. Now, let's say you're a woman and you've divorced your husband and you want to annul your marriage because you want to marry again, but your ex-husband does not want to cooperate, then you run into a very grave problem. You can't really go very far with that. I think there are ways around that. The other thing is, of course, you say to somebody who tells you about the horror of their first marriage, and they say, I want the marriage annulled. And you say, okay, well, we have to contact your ex-husband. Where is he? And they say, oh, no, I don't want you to contact my ex-husband. And you say, are you sure about that? Yeah. And say, well, in that case, you can't get an annulment in the first place. I mean, maybe there's a way around it. But, the co-respondent has got a right to know that his marriage or her marriage is about to be annulled. It can't be done without their consent. And quite often, people who are divorced never want to hear from their ex-husband or wife ever again. And they also don't want their ex-husband or wife to know where they are. They might have some very good reasons for that as well. So it is very awkward. Yes.
Consent, but knowledge, I understand, but consent?
Consent means I do. In other words, I freely enter into the state of marriage, of a wedlock.
In terms of
what do you mean?
Consent to the annulment.
No, they don't have to consent to the annulment, but they have to be informed about it. They have to be told that it's happening. They can contest the annulment, of course. Now, I do know somebody in Malta. In Malta, it's even worse than Ascoli Piceno. It goes on forever. Sometimes in Malta, annulments used to take about 10 years. And I do know a woman who had an annulment, and every year she gave us an update. And then she said, one of my brothers used to ask her, so Rosa, how is your annulment going? So, oh, his evidence, my evidence, blah, 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 blah. Now it's going to appeal. And after about 10 years, she said, and do you know, the 10th year, she said to my brother, do you know what he did? Do you know what the bastard did? The annulment came through. And you know what he did the very next day? He died. So, isn't it? After all that. Anyway, and of course, I mean, in some parts of the world, in Malta, to have real kudos, you had to have 2 annulments. And there were 1 or 2 who had been through 2 annulments. Okay. Yeah. And I don't know. Yeah, I know. Quite. You'll be in your 80s by then. Yeah. I know. Anyway, I've talked about that. Any questions about that?
Yeah, just run that scenario of a Catholic being married in an Anglican church and that not being.
Yeah. Now, what happens is if a man comes to the parish priest and says, I want to get married, but my wife is a devout Anglican, and we've noticed that your church is not very attractive, but her church is beautiful, we'd like to get married to the Anglican church, then the parish priest would say, fine, I will give you permission, and there's a form you fill out, and you have to send it to the diocese, and you request dispensation from canonical form. And essentially what happens is it makes the Anglican vicar the delegate of the Catholic parish priest marrying that person.
So,
And that person is marrying in the Catholic sense. You see, that's the key thing to it, because we recognise Anglican marriages and indeed civil marriages as completely valid. Now, this does, a lot of people don't seem to know this, that you do need the permission or the consent or the permission or the delegation of your parish priest to marry, even if you're getting married in in another church. Usually it will be readily granted to get married in an Anglican church or a Methodist church or something like that. It won't be granted, I don't think, to get married in a mosque. And it will not be granted to get married on a beach in Bali. It's got to take it. You cannot do a Catholic wedding outside a church. I did look into this the other day. You can't get married on a beach.
Could you have a blessing? Say you got married in a registry office. Then could you have a blessing?
No. What would happen is, if you get married in the registry office, and this is actually very common, and people say, "Oh, we didn't know we had to get married in church," and you say to them, "Would you like what is called, would you like a convalidation?" Now, a convalidation basically is two things. There are two types of convalidation. One is extremely complicated, so it's never done. And the other one is basically, we'll do a second wedding for you in church, just like it should have been in the beginning. Except we won't have the blue form, which is what you have when you get married. Because one of the things is, when you get, actually they've changed the blue form now, yet you get this thing that you sign. One of the things, when a priest marries you in church, the priest is the delegate of the registrar. He is the authorized person, authorized by the registrar. So the priest does a religious wedding and he does a civil wedding at the same time. It's changed in the sense that in good old days, you'd have to go get a blue form, and then the priest would fill in the register, the civil register, which to keep in the safe. Now, the priest no longer has to keep the civil register in the safe. What he does, you just get a form, they sign it, and then the priest sends it back to the registrar. I used to do a lot of work with the registrar in Brighton. Her name was Dendy. Dendy, it was really Denise. Dendy Blanc. She was half Catholic, half Jewish. She informed me. I have to tell you, she was absolutely gorgeous. She was about 65. Dendy something. Yes, I know. We'll cut this bit out. She was great fun, and I was always going down there because I was having marriages of travellers, which are slightly complex. But the thing is, now, so the priest acts as the authorized person for the registrar, the witness for the registrar. The registrar doesn't have to come out. Now, in France, it's different. You get married twice. You go the day before to the mairie and you get married by the mayor. And then the next day or the same day, you get married in church. They're two separate ceremonies. The other thing is that the Catholic Church will not marry you unless you've got a civil marriage as well. But now, it so happens in France that if you are a rich old lady whose husband has conveniently died, and you meet a rich old gentleman whose wife has conveniently died, and you say, "Let's get married," and you say, "I'm very rich, you're very rich, but we've all got children," and it might muck up the inheritance, because they have Code Napoleon. You know, the children have an automatic right to inherit the. So what you do is you get a dodgy priest to marry you purely religiously and not do a civil wedding, and that is against canon law. The only priests who will do it are the priests of Marcel Lefebvre. Yeah, it's against canon law. You're not allowed to marry people unless they're going to be civilly married as well, because then they're joined legally as well as the religious joining together is a legal joining together as well. So you can't do so it's a slightly awkward. Now, what was the other question you asked?
The other question I was going to get to was, in a registry office, which is purely a recognition in sort of civil law that you are.
It's purely secular.
It's purely secular.
Yeah, it's also 100% valid. Because marriage is a secular reality. It's not, it's a secular reality.
So it's not valid. So it's the Catholic Church.
If one of them's a Catholic, it's invalid. But if they're both non-Catholics, it's valid. The Muslims, when they get married, it's valid. Not with multiple wives, but the first wife, it's valid. All these people who get married without ever going near a Catholic church, if they're not Catholics, it is valid. Where were you married? Oh, sorry, you don't want to put this on the internet.
We were married in St Paul's.
Yeah, and that was valid. You were not a Catholic at the time, and you're a member of the CA, and it was valid. It was valid. I mean, you know, if two people get married in the registry office and neither of them is a Catholic, it is valid.
So if you get married...
I mean, when Adam and Eve got married, there was no Catholic Church to make it valid, was there? The Catholic Church does not make it valid. The people make it valid. The consent makes it valid.
So if you get married in a registry office,
yeah,
and one's a Catholic,
yeah, it's invalid.
What do you do to make it valid? You
well,
have to go through another marriage.
Yes, you would have to go through another marriage. And one of the problems is, I mean, I've had people who've said to me, oh, you know, I married my husband in the registry office, but I've always wanted to get married in church, but he won't. And I said, well, can't you persuade him? He said, no, he won't. Absolutely not. Not a very nice man, is all I can say. And that's a bit of a pity, isn't it? And you do get people like this who will not cooperate in some way. But a Catholic, you do get Catholics who are not properly married, who perhaps think they're properly married, but had defect of canonical form. Either they were not going to church at the time they got married or something like that.
Does that mean then they would be treated so you can't take Holy Communion? You can't. Yeah. And can you do retrospective?
Yes, you can. No, well, all annulments are retrospective, aren't they? Because the marriage happened in the past.
Everything was all right before the marriage, but then when they're married, they find out that the partner is vile and abusive. And
most partners are vile. Some of the time, at least, vile.
There's a reason why you can't, for safety and your children and everything. If I was to kill a Muslim, I thought that was a condition that I could then get an annulment.
No, you can't, unfortunately. One of the things that was very common in Africa, which they struggled with, is that I remember them saying, surely they should put off the wedding until the woman has produced a son. I said, no. I said, well, okay, well, why can't they get an annulment? Because if she doesn't produce a son, because a man only wants to marry a woman if she can give him sons. Henry VIII's argument, not quite, but the point is that, but you can't. This thing about condition, a marriage subject to a future condition, to a condition about the future, cannot be contracted validly. If you say, I'm going to get married to you, but you've got to give me sons, otherwise it's, no.
But genuinely, what if there's a massive abuse situation and you find out he's a paedophile and you've got children and things, and you want to marry someone else, you can't because you're hooked up to this
nightmare person. Yeah. Yes, I think you would have to. There is something. Those who are not able to assume the essential obligations of marriage are causes of a psychic nature. I don't think it means psychic like is there anyone there? I think they mean psychological. Mm-hmm. So I think if you were married to somebody who was deeply psychologically flawed, that would be grounds for annulment. And there was a lady I once knew who discovered that when after 10 years of marriage and several children, that her husband was not really the marrying kind. And therefore, they divorced. And she was deceived in his true nature. And she, that possibly, I think, would be grounds for annulment. And similarly, if you do discover if your husband had something wrong with him from the beginning, which precluded him marrying. I mean, nowadays they've invented something called sexual addiction, haven't they?
Yeah.
And, you know, you say, my husband is a sex addict and he's always rushing off with or running off and this, that, and the other. And therefore, he was incapable of being faithful and undertaking the task of faithfulness. Therefore, the marriage was invalid. Maybe, if you accept that sex addiction is a thing, a special sort of thing, rather than just human nature. I mean, you know, you do wonder, don't you?
Michael Douglas. I'm just going to say.
What, Michael Douglas?
Very well known one. Yeah.
Was he?
Well, he said he was.
Even though he had Catherine Zeta.
Catherine Zeta, and she was. I have to tell you, she was absolutely gorgeous, Catherine Zeta. Are they?
Before his first wife,
Dandruff. Okay, yeah, I mean, but you know, the trouble is, in America, you can invent virtually anything as an addiction to sort of get yourself out of. If you're living in sort of, you know, Scully Piceno or Bryce Norton, I don't think that would wash with the local tribunal. Whereas if you were in Los Angeles, they'd say, yeah, maybe, right. But Arundel, right? I don't know. But you know, it's. I mean, these things will not get past the tribunal in places like Malta, but in other places, in California, Virginia, I think, you know, probably they do. I mean, the annulment process is flawed in that it is local. And as I say, in, you know, whether you're living in Nairobi, you're living in Malta, you're living in Italy, or you're living in Britain or America, it's not a level playing field. And you can get your annulment either in the place of your residence or the place where you were married. So if you are living in north of the river, you're in Westminster. If you're south of the river, you're in Southwark. That might make a big difference.
So people could move. Just nowadays.
Well, so I thought in America, someone could move to like California, where it's more liberal, than another state.
They could do, I suppose. I suppose so, yeah. I mean, it is open to abuse. The thing is, of course, we've got to realise that the law of God does not permit a marriage to be set aside. And therefore, you may convince a tribunal that your marriage was null and void from the beginning. But have you convinced God? You might have pulled the wool over the eyes of a few monsignori in Valletta, but you might not have pulled the wool over. You won't pull the wool over the eyes of God. Yeah. So, you know, that's how it works. So it certainly has, because people don't understand it, it has brought the Catholic Church into disrepute amongst certain people, particularly since Boris' affair did, and particularly, I suppose, the affair of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII did to some extent. There were one of the first things the Protestant reformers did was liberalise the laws of divorce. Obviously, you know, Henry VIII was a great one for getting divorced. And but also, for example, George I was divorced, and because his lovely wife Sophia Dorothea was found to be playing away from home, and so he divorced her and imprisoned her for 30 years, didn't he? Which and also the daughter of George II was divorced by the King of Denmark. I think she married the King of Denmark, and she was found up to no good, and so he locked her up. And George III, it was George III's sister. He was very upset by that. And I'm trying to think of other monarchs who got divorced. Oh, yes, the other person who got divorced.
Charles III.
Yes, I forgot about that. Also, George IV tried to get divorced, but failed. In those days, you could only get divorced by a special act of the House of Lords. An act of Parliament was the only way to divorce you. And George IV failed to get divorced. Do you remember Queen Caroline of Brunswick fought the divorce, and they all said, "Gracious Queen, we thee implore, go away and sin no more. If the effort be too great, go away at any rate." Caroline of Brunswick was carrying on in Italy in an immoral way, and so on and so forth. But he was ghastly as well. They were both equally awful. But it was very hard. But the Protestantism didn't really hold against divorce in the same way as Catholics. And Luther got into terrible trouble by telling the Elector of Saxony he couldn't take a second wife, and so on and so forth. And there was also somebody else, another fame. If you remember Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, Maria Rushworth is divorced, and she has to go and live in a remote farmhouse with Aunt Norris. which must have been awful. And so it did happen in those days that some people did get divorced, but it was very, very rare. The Orthodox do it all the time. You're allowed 2 divorces in the Orthodox Church. Well, just kindness. So but it's 3 strikes and you're out. But yes, but you're allowed up to 3 divorces. Although it will depend on which Orthodox Church you're a member of. It might be easier in Russia than it is in Greece or wherever, and so on and so forth. But divorces, I mean, clearly, one of the things is we do believe divorce is a bad thing, and it is a negative thing. But sometimes it's necessary because the woman, as you rightly say, has to protect herself from her psychotic husband. At the same time, the people need to go into marriage understanding what they're going into. And that, of course, is very hard because by the time they come to the priest, it's already too late. They've made their minds up about getting married. And it's already too late to well, sometimes I think it's only happened to me about once, where I really did think they should not get married.
And did you say? Were you able to say you would do?
I didn't.
Can you say or not?
Well, you could, but I didn't think they would listen.
I did say to a friend once.
Don't marry that man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Happened to be a friend.
Yeah.
But
and she did.
She did.
Yeah.
There was a big argument. We still got invited to the wedding.
Oh yeah.
3 of us.
Yeah.
And
it didn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one of a very good friend of mine, her mother said, I don't want you to marry this man, he's ghastly. Even his mother says he's ghastly, and his grandmother says he's ghastly. And it opened up a huge breach between her and her mother. And of course, later on, they got divorced. So the mother was right. Everybody was right. The terrible thing is when you tell people this, they don't really listen to you because they made their minds up. And I'm trying to think of other people who have been told before the wedding date. Well, Prince William allegedly said to Prince Harry, "Are you sure about this girl?" It does happen. It does happen, doesn't it? Usually that's all. And I do remember another friend of mine told another friend of mine, said, "Oh, I don't think you should marry him." And she said to her, "Never mention that to me again." They're still together, quite happy, I think. So, I mean, it's very difficult telling somebody they're making a terrible mistake.
Priest, is it not? Does it not fall upon you to say, I don't think, no?
It does, but I have to say yes, but you need guts to say it, don't you?
Yeah, I suppose you need also something more than just an inkling, I suppose you get a feeling.
You get a feeling, and you'd have to have some sort of evidence, but usually it's just a feeling.
I mean, how often would you know the 2 parties well enough?
No, you're supposed to see the 2 parties 4 times before they're married.
Well,
no, it's not enough. I mean, they want His Lordship, Monsignor Moth, has decreed that people should undergo a 2-year course before they get married. But of course, the trouble is, most of them won't wait 2 years before getting married. So a lot of the couples who come to us, it's far too late for them to because they've already got children. And if they've got children, should you say to them, it's time for you to separate? You wouldn't do that, would you? Because that would impact negatively on the child. You'd say it's time for you to get married and maybe stay married or decide. Sometimes I think you should say to people, well, I don't think you should get married. I remember, yes, I did say this once. A Nigerian couple came to me and they said, oh, we need to get married. I said, oh, yeah. And they said, we need to get married next week. I said, no, sorry, impossible. You can't do that. In those days, you had to give 6 months notice. I said, oh, no, it's terrible. He said, her mother's coming and from Nigeria. And she thinks we're married already. Now we need to get married before she turns up. Yeah, I know. Carry on with the descent. But I said that is not a good reason to get married. It's not a good reason to get married. And unfortunately, a lot of people do get married without really good reasons to get married. Or they think it's a good reason at the time, or maybe they're sort of deluded, or they're sort of, spur of the moment people. My parents knew each other for a very short time before they got married, but they did get married during the Second World War. And a lot of people got married in the Second World War in a hurry.
Or just after.
Or just after. Really? What happened?
These arranged marriages that work.
You do have arranged marriages at work and
Appear to work.
Appear to work. I mean, I think all arranged marriages are a very good thing, but they should be arranged by the bride and groom themselves, without any outside interference. Yes. I mean, I mean, you do have arranged marriages, particularly in mafia families. You have arranged marriages, and in 'ndrangheta families, where you have a clan system, and people say, "Oh, I think you really ought to marry him because he's a good guy and he works with your father," and things like that.
That also happens in the elite of our society, doesn't it?
One of the things that's very interesting in the elite of our society, people, there's what's called exogamous marriage and endogamous marriage. Exogamous is when you marry outside the clan, and endogamous within the clan or within the whatever. Now, for example, most of the aristocracy are related to each other. So, for example, Nancy Mitford was a remote cousin of Clementine Churchill. And it was quite common. It is still quite common that people of the aristocracy, which is about 800 families, 600 families, the proper aristocracy, they're all related. And that would be normal. But presumably, it's also the case that all the I'm trying to think of something similar. All the teachers in Surrey, they're all related to each other, or their children are all related to each other, or something like that. You do tend to marry in to your group. Not always, but often you do. In Trinidad, everybody's related to everybody else.
Prince William, didn't
he? Yeah, that's true. He married out, didn't he? He married a commoner.
So he married.
He married a commoner. The Queen married. The Queen married her third cousin. Elizabeth II married her third cousin. George VI married out. Well, he married an aristocrat, but George V married a cousin. Edward VII married. She was a remote cousin. I think she was a third or fourth cousin. Queen Victoria married her first cousin. George IV married his first cousin disastrously. Frederick, Prince of Wales. No, George III married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. They must have been related somehow or another. And all of the descendants of Queen Victoria, quite a lot of them married each other. I mean, Lord Mountbatten wanted Prince Charles to marry Amanda Knatchbull, but he didn't. Amanda Knatchbull would have been his second or third cousin, I think. But that does happen. That does happen. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Marrying your first cousin is a very bad thing, and marrying your niece is a very bad thing. But other marrying somebody who is in the one family in England who've all married each other, the Guinnesses, they're all interrelated. Yeah, and I think there are several hundred descendants of Arthur Guinness, but they've all married each other. I mean, not quite, but
That's why the stout is so bitter.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. But some have married out and so on. But people tend to marry like birds of a feather flock together. Well, it's very important if you're Jewish to marry somebody else who is Jewish. And it used to be very important if you were Catholic to marry somebody else who was Catholic. And I think that should be stressed. You should marry a Catholic. I think everybody here, apart from me, is married already, so that's fine. But if possible, marry a Catholic. It's a good idea, don't you think?
What about priests marrying?
No, never. I'm 61. I'm too old. Thank you. Right. No. I mean, we do have married priests because we have in the ordinariate and so on. But it does bring problems with it. Yes, it does. It does. But let's not talk about that. We actually had a priest who was divorced and annulled.
And then became a priest.
Yeah, he then became a priest. Yeah. Okay, I think we've stopped there. We've been getting off 54 minutes, 18 seconds. All the best. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. Bye.